right, so what we need to finish up today is we basically talked about just about all of the characteristics and adaptation of fish that we needed to. We could talk a little bit about anatomy and parts and some terms that are used when you're talking about anatomy of an animal. And then we'll move on to amphibians. All right, so if we look here at this diagram of the fish, okay, and we look at the various parts, we use some terms. When we're talking about an animal, we use terms like dorsal, ventral, posterior, anterior. And so the anterior end of an animal is basically the head end. Anterior is the head end. You have these filament, okay? But you don't have that. And then the tail end, or maybe the foot end, if we're talking about, land animal, would be the posterior. When we talk about the back side, like the spine side of a vertebrate, we use the word dorsal. And for the belly side, we use the word ventral. Those are terms that are used often also in anatomy of other animals and humans, for example. You know what the term ACL is? What it stands for? Probably know it's a knee, part of your knee. You know what it stands for?
Achilles?
No. No, not Achilles.
Tendon?
It's no, it's not a tendon. The L stands for ligament. The A stands for anterior cruciate ligament, ACL. That's because it's towards the front of your knee and it sort of stabilizes your knee joint. So these terms are used all the time. All right, if we look,
What about axial?
it's medial, so it's like and there's other ligaments in there, and we talk about muscle groups and things, or if you're talking about the location of an injury, you may say that it's anterior to the tendon. So those terms are used to help people understand where something is. All right, so when we look at the fish have nostrils that they use. Again, they can sense chemicals in the water, basically a sense of smell in the water. They have very good eyesight. Talked about that. See in color and in black and white. This, what is this pointing to? What do you think that is? I know the term's on there, but Ian?
Basically the outside of the gills.
Yeah, that's the gill covering. This is called the operculum. The dorsal fin is the fin that's on the back side of the fish that you might call the tail of the fish. It's called the caudal fin. Fins up towards the front near the gills are pectoral fins. There's a lateral line. And then the gill cover. This is called the operculum is the technical term for it. But it's a protective cover because remember those gills inside of there are very fine, very delicate, can easily be damaged. So they're covered by this sort of bony plate called the operculum. And it opens and closes as water is being passed over that. If we look at the internal organs of a fish, again, we have a few different things to talk about. So first of all, the sides are the same, anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral. So the brain of a fish is up front, behind sort of the eyes. It's pretty small. It's pretty simple. A couple sort of, especially an enlarged area of the spinal cord. So attached to that brain is the spinal cord, which runs through the vertebrae, through the backbone.
So which one is it supposed to be up?
This one?
No, the brain.
There's three sections of it there. This whole area here. And the spinal cord and nerves branch out from that. Inside, sort of right towards the middle of the fish, is the swim bladder. Now, in some fish, the swim bladder is open to the digestive system. It's one way they can get air into it. Others, it's not. It just depends on the type of fish. But that's the swim bladder. Remember that inflates and deflates, changing the buoyancy of the fish. That's the swim bladder. The heart is down here. It's on the ventral side, just below the gills. Pretty simple heart. It has just two chambers, an atrium where blood flows in and a ventricle where the blood flows out. Okay, it circulates around through these blood vessels. The gills are back here, so we have the blood vessels that pass over the gills. And back behind them a little bit, you can see that's where the actual gills are. And again, they're filled with these tiny little capillaries where the maximum absorption of oxygen can take place. Their digestive system's pretty simple. Stomach and some intestine, which eventually leads out of the body where they remove waste. Those are the parts of the fish. Internal. Here? This one? That's just showing an artery, if you want to label it. It's not labeled on mine or not. But that's an artery. All right, so start with fish. Fish were the first vertebrates that evolved. Eventually, as time went on, some groups of fish kind of split off and started to become able to spend part of their lives on land. As we talked about yesterday, some fish have means of obtaining oxygen from air as well as water. Some fish have a lung. Some fish absorb oxygen through their skin or through their swim bladder. Okay, so eventually some fish evolve the ability to come onto land for a longer time. And those are what we call amphibians. Okay? Amphibians is our second class of vertebrates. And the word comes from two words, ampha and bios, which means double life. And this is because most amphibians go through a process of metamorphosis. What's the one you're probably familiar with? Okay, Catherine? Tadpole to frog, yes. Also has the meaning that amphibians can spend part of their life on land and part in the water. In fact, they must return to the water at one specific time. Within the amphibian class, there's basically just three types of amphibians, three larger groups, orders. There are the frogs, okay, which have smooth, moist skin, long hind legs. There's toads, or drier, bumpy skin, shorter legs. And then there are the salamanders and newts. Can you get warts from a toad? I mean, you've heard that, right? You cannot. Warts are caused by a virus, not a toad. So we have things like, poison dart frogs. Most amphibians that have been identified are frogs. They go from, the smallest amphibians are tiny, less than a centimeter big frogs. The largest, it's a Chinese salamander that can be up to 6 feet long. So we have frogs, we have toads, and we have salamanders. So frogs and amphibians, I should say amphibians, they're also cold-blooded, ectothermic. Their body temperature changes depending on their environment. So again, right now in our area, you're not going to see a lot of frogs and toads hopping around. The body temperatures drop way down. They're hibernating throughout the winter. They can't be active at this temperature because their body temperatures drop so far. Like we said, frogs go through this process of metamorphosis, okay, which begins, and we'll look tomorrow at some of these stages. And that metamorphosis, just like it was in insects, is a change in the structure of the body over time. And it's very distinct in frogs. They hatch from eggs into, you guys told me earlier, tadpoles. And tadpoles are the larval stage of the frog. They're very fish-like. They don't have any limbs. They have a tail. They breathe using gills. So there are lots of fish-like characteristics. But as those tadpoles grow and as they develop, they begin to change. And they start to grow legs. Their tail starts to shrink. They start to develop lungs. They grow front limbs. And start to become more and more frog-like. Until they eventually reach the adult frog stage, where they can then reproduce and lay eggs and repeat. As far as circulation, the heart of amphibians is a little more complex than the heart of the fish. Amphibians have a three-chambered heart. So they have two atria and one ventricle. And the benefit of this is it's more efficient for getting the deoxygenated blood to the lungs or to the gills. Deoxygenated blood in the amphibian comes in one side, oxygenated blood comes in the other side. It gets moved down into the ventricle, and there is some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But they're kept a little bit more separate. In a fish, for example, all the blood gets mixed together. So you have some blood that's rich in oxygen getting mixed with blood that's poor in oxygen, so it's not quite as efficient. But a three-chambered heart allows some separation between those two types of blood, so the deoxygenated blood can be sent to the lungs, oxygenated blood can be sent off to the body. They can get oxygen in several ways, amphibians, like we said. Many amphibians can absorb oxygen through their skin. They're very, very thin skin, and the underside of that skin is covered in capillaries that can absorb oxygen through diffusion. And they can do this throughout their life. They also can breathe using gills. This is generally in the young larval stages, the tadpole stages. They have gills, again adapted to extracting oxygen from the water they live in. They eventually disappear though. And then lungs, obviously, during the adult stages, they're adapted to obtaining oxygen from the air, breathing on land. Couple last things about the amphibians. Like I said earlier, they're cold-blooded. Therefore, in cold environments, they generally hibernate in the winter. Again, basically going into a state of dormancy where all of their body's processes slow way down. They require no food, very little oxygen, and so forth. Basically, they bury themselves in the mud or some sort of burrow and wait out the winter. For reproduction, the other thing about hibernation is amphibians build up an organ called fat bodies. And you're going to see that when we do our frog dissection in a couple months, When you look inside of the frog, what you'll see is a series of these small, sort of orangish yellow shaped things that fill up the abdomen of the frog. Okay? And these are fat bodies. What happens is in the spring and the summer, when there's an abundance of food, the frogs will store up extra energy, extra calories get stored in these fat bodies. And they grow and they get larger and larger. So therefore, when they're hibernating in the winter and they don't have access to any food, they can then use that stored up energy to keep them alive. Okay? So it's their means of storing energy for the winter. Reproduction, amphibians also have external fertilization like fish. Females release eggs into the water generally. Males release sperm into the water. They fertilize the eggs, where they then can grow and eventually hatch. They produce fewer eggs than fish. You know, in the hundreds or thousands, but not hundreds of thousands like some fish. And their eggs are laid generally in the spring is when they reproduce. And their eggs have this sort of coating of jelly. Has anybody ever found frog eggs like in your pool or in a stream or? Yeah. So if you pick them up, they're all these tiny little eggs, little embryos that they've been fertilized in a jelly-like coating that sort of keeps them all together, keeps them in one place, so they don't just disperse, wash away. And those eggs eventually hatch into tadpoles. Any questions about any of the amphibians? Yes? Yeah?
When they bury themselves in bugs and hibernation, do they do that to keep them from freezing?
Yeah, they bury themselves just as an insulation, sort of to keep a little bit warmer. Yeah, but some amphibians can freeze solid and have special, almost like antifreeze-like compounds in their blood so that it doesn't, their cells don't burst when they freeze. So yeah, there's a variety of ways some animals have of dealing with that. Any questions? Other questions? All right.